Welcome back to the channel. Today's video is a little bit of a weird one. It's kind of story time. It's kind of atheist experience, but not overtly. Hear me out. I will say before getting into this that this is my third version of doing this video because I want to make sure that I'm saying things clearly and I really don't want to be misunderstood on this. I'm worried about this because the left will eat itself. I'm worried about what I said being taken in a way that was absolutely not intended, and I don't think it was even an issue really, other than the feedback I got from one student. And so, given how outrage culture has developed, and hashtag canceled, and the internet hate machine, and all of these things, I think my story kind of fits into that, and I'm just gonna keep rambling until I stop myself, so this is me cutting myself off, and let's just get into the stupid story already. Let me set the scene here. This was when I was adjuncting out of country, and it was at what historically was a Catholic university. I never would have known that it had this history had my husband's advisor not brought it up just sort of offhand one day. I looked through their website today to see if there was any hint of this history anywhere, and I couldn't find it. So it's more an artifact and a relic of the school's founding than the reality of the school today. However, I found out this information from my husband's boss, basically, before I started teaching. As such, I was very careful when I was teaching not to let it slip that I was an atheist. It probably could have been inferred by some students, and certainly was, story for another day, but I tried not to let that aspect of my life come into my teaching, come into how I talked about things. It did not come up, and I tried to not let it influence the way I covered material. When this story happened, I was teaching intro psych for the third time. It was my third year teaching intro psych, and I had 2 sections of it that year. As such, I had a lot of the kinks worked out in the lectures. I knew what to talk about, what to emphasize, what needed elaboration, what stories to tell that really helped the material sink in for students, what jokes to tell, all of these things. It was my third time teaching it. I mostly understood what I needed to do and how to say things. Chronologically, in terms of where this fell in the week, this was the first class. It met Monday, Wednesday in the afternoon. The second class met Tuesday, Thursday in the mornings. And so it was the afternoon class. The room that this class was in was absolutely due for a retrofit. And I think my year teaching in there was the last year they used it before renovating. It needed it so bad. It was set up basically like a theater, and probably could be used as a theater sometimes. There was a stage that I taught from. There was a screen that came down that slides were projected onto from a projector, which was somewhere in the middle of the room. This classroom could probably seat 200 students or 200 people easily. And my class, I think, was 120, 130 in that section. But usually somewhere between 70 and 80 would regularly show up when it wasn't test day. So this classroom, as I said, there's a stage, and then the seating sloped out and up. And the seats were those lovely seats that fold down, kind of cushiony, and then the stupid desk thing that folds up, that, real estate of the desk is tiny. Hate those rooms as a student, but it is what it is. It was what it was. One thing I want to note about this arrangement of seating is there were 3 sort of sections. There was the middle section, which had a lot of students just front to back, randomly interspersed. There was stage right, and I really hope I didn't get that backwards. And on that side, it was kind of dark. Did have a fair number of students sitting there, front to back. That's where the DMT guy sat, and he is just so many stories for another day. But I bring him up because he kind of would clear space around him because he grew marijuana at home and always reeked of it. Like, you could smell it 10 feet away from him, so students would try to not sit next to him. So, one sort of void of space on that side. On the stage left wing of this classroom, there weren't so many students. It was an awkward angle to see the projector screen. On this side, there weren't so many students. Usually the people who sat over here would come to class, but they wouldn't really be at class. They'd be on their laptops, they'd be on their phones, they'd be talking. And fortunately, with the way the acoustics were in this room, it didn't really impact the other students so much, but I could hear it. I could hear them chatting. I couldn't usually hear what they were talking about, although there were a couple times I did stop class and guys, I can hear you. If I can hear you clearly talking about your plans for tomorrow night, other people in the room are hearing you. Quit it. On the section, there were a couple groups of people, and one group that was particularly talkative during class and relatively disruptive sat very back corner, and they came to class, which is more than a lot of students, but yeah, and I'm emphasizing this group because it will come up. This incident happened towards the end of class. We are in social psych, which most intro psych textbooks will put in chapter 15 or 16 of 16 chapters. It is nobody's priority. Sorry, social psychologists. That's the intro psych textbook writers for you. And so we're talking about social psych. We're talking about the bystander effect. The bystander effect is this effect where basically you are less likely to help somebody who needs help if there are other people around you. Bystanders. If there's less people, you're more likely to help. There's also other factors that impact how likely you are to help somebody in need. And we're talking about a few of these. One of these is if you're in a rush or not. I like to talk about experiments when they exist to support what we're talking about, and there was an experiment for this. In 1973, in New York, I believe, there were a group of seminary students. So these are guys who are training to be priests in the Catholic faith. And there's a group of students who were recruited into this study. They were not told about the true nature of this experiment. So talking about subterfuge and things that we talked about in the ethics video. In this experiment, the seminary students were brought in and they were asked why they were going into the priesthood, if they were doing it for themselves, for their family, for a higher calling, why they wanted to devote their lives to this. They thought it was about how intrinsic this need or this drive to be a priest was, and they weren't told the true nature of the experiment. The seminary students were told after the survey they'd have to go to a different building on campus. I believe this took place at Cornell. They'd have to go to a different building on campus and give a talk to a group of students about the Good Samaritan story from the Bible. And this is important. If you're as up to date on biblical stories as I am, let me just summarize the Wikipedia on this story because it is relevant. It is a parable told by Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. It is about a traveler who is stripped of clothing, beaten, and left half dead alongside the road. First a priest and then a Levite comes by, but both avoid the man. Finally, a Samaritan happens upon the traveler. Samaritans and Jews despised each other, but the Samaritan helps the injured man. Jesus is described as telling the parable in response to the question from a lawyer, "And who is my neighbor?" In response, Jesus tells the parable, the conclusion of which is that the neighbor figure in the parable is the man who shows mercy to the injured man, that is, the Samaritan. So this talk was in a separate building, and as they finished up the survey, they were told one of three things, randomly assigned. This is the manipulation of the experiment. One condition is they were told, you leave now, you'll make it on time, but you're not in a rush, you've got some time. Second thing they could be told, so second condition, is they need to leave now. They'll make it, but they need to leave now. They can't dilly-dally around. They need to go directly to the building, but they'll make it on time. Third condition is they were told that they're late. The survey ran long. They need to go. They're expected. They need to get there now. Hurry. So now we're getting into the interesting part of the experiment. So, survey building and the place where the seminary students were supposed to talk about the Good Samaritan story. In between, there was Confederate staged. So if you recall from the ethics video, which hopefully you've watched, a Confederate is somebody who is in on the experiment. They are not just a random person who happens to be there. They are part of the experiment. And this Confederate was staged in between the pathway between these buildings so that the seminary student had to interact with them in order to make it to the talk place. The experiment was set up so that the Confederate would fall ill in front of the seminary student. So the seminary student is walking to where they think they're going to talk about the Good Samaritan. Confederate falls ill, and what does the seminary student do? Basically, the results of this experiment were that the more in a rush the seminary student was, the less likely they were to help this Confederate. I should point out that the staging was such that for the seminary student to make it past the Confederate without helping, they had to step over them. So it was a very obvious situation that they could help with. And they found that the more in a rush the seminary students were in, the less likely they were to help. So that's the experiment. To really drive the point home in lecture, I say something along the lines of these seminary students are training to be priests. These people represent the best of us. And even these people, when in a rush, fell prey to the same bystander effect sort of things that we're talking about in class. No one is immune from this. That's about as hard as I push it. I don't talk about my personal feelings about the Catholic Church, the Vatican, the popes, the cover-ups, the abuse. I don't talk about any of that. That doesn't come up. It's not relevant for this. All I say is that these seminary students who are supposed to be the best of us and represent the best in us still failed to help somebody in need because of circumstances that were kind of outside of their control. I'm not talking shit. This is the finding of the experiment. Bottom line, these guys are human too, and there's predictors on helping behavior, and we understand when someone is more likely to help somebody and when they're not. That's it. As I've alluded to, this is not the first time I've lectured about this. This is my third time teaching intro psych, third time going over this experiment. This was taught to me in intro psych and also cognitive and social. And it's come up. I was taught it by, I think, somebody who is culturally Jewish. And this is an experiment. These are the outcomes. Like, this is a thing. This is the science. As I said, this class met Monday, Wednesday in the afternoon. So Wednesday morning, I get this email in my inbox. Firstly, I would like to say that I thoroughly enjoy your class. Thank you for making psychology very enjoyable for me. Okay, cool, great. I'm being set up for a compliment sandwich. Secondly, however, I have a concern with the way priests were ridiculed and mocked in front of the class on Monday afternoon. The class was about how prejudice and discrimination are morally wrong and should not be practiced towards people. However, I'm afraid that your behavior and attitudes towards the priest during the lecture came off as very ridiculing and condescending. I am not a Roman Catholic. Nonetheless, I was concerned, and I know a number of students, some religious, some irreligious, were rather upset. I would like to politely ask on behalf of these students that an apology be made to the class for this public demonstration of discrimination. Okay, so there's the middle part of the compliment sandwich. Again, thank you for teaching us. We appreciate your effort greatly. Okay, so the other part of the compliment sandwich is a little soggy, but moving on. Sincerely yours, student. Reading this email, I was floored. Mocked? Ridiculed? What? What? So I sat there and trying to think if I had taught this any differently than the previous times. And the other section had met, and I actually had students come up to me after class and like, wow, that was really cool and interesting. Like, crazy that they would think to test that. That was really cool. And it's amazing that people who are training to help other people, in essence, would still do these sorts of things when the circumstances were right for it or wrong for it. And So I was going over my thoughts, how I phrased it, how I talked about it. Did I use a weird tone? Did I do something different this time? And I came up with nothing. All I said was that these men represent the best in us, and they're still just human. After reading the email and going through like this mental like, oh my god phase, I was in a little bit of a panic. Like, one, I never want to hurt people's feelings. Even when I very sincerely, down to my core, disagree with them, I don't want to hurt people's feelings. I don't want my feelings hurt. I don't want to hurt other people's feelings. And if I had hurt somebody's feelings in the class, like, that's not good. Also, I don't certainly want to discriminate against anybody or put people off or any of these things. Like, I'm very careful in trying to avoid these things. Second, I dislike confrontation. I've learned to put on my teaching hat and, have the conversations with students about, you need to show up to class, you're going to flunk, or in managing teaching assistants who are less than helpful, like reprimanding them and trying to get them to act in line with what they should be doing. I've had to do it. I've gotten somewhat thicker skin about these things, but for something like this, I don't know how to handle it. Finally, I'm afraid of the consequences. As an adjunct teacher, I am an at-will employee. They can get rid of me in a heartbeat. And granted, it was towards the end of the semester, but they could still can me, and I could lose out on like a month or two of pay, and that would absolutely suck. And it would also suck because I would know that I got fired for speaking wrongly, and I don't think I did, but there's that possibility that I fucked up somehow. So it was a few hours before class, did some hard thinking, consulted my husband and best friend Lily, who is a recovering Catholic, about like, did I fuck up? Like, what do I do? Part of me, scientist in me, took over and like, okay, let's gather more information. Let's figure out what's going on here. So I sent the student a couple emails and never got a response. First email to the student read, I'm glad you're enjoying the class. Can you tell me more about the behaviors and attitudes that were troublesome or offensive? I've tried to pull up what I said or did that was discriminatory, but haven't been able to pin down anything. I gave this email an hour, maybe two, before I sent her a follow-up email. I would also be interested in hearing directly from the students who are upset so I can get their perspective directly. I'm trying to gather information here, like, did I fuck up? What did I say? What did I do? What was perceived? What happened? And she never got back to me on this. So in my head now, there's two possibilities. One, these students who were legitimately offended were afraid of coming forward for retribution. I can't rule out that possibility. Second possibility is that these students don't exist. That the student who emailed me was taking offense for other people or perceived other people and trying to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves, even though they might not be offended in actuality. Like, I can't say for sure which of those possibilities is true. With no response from the student on those emails and class approaching, I decided to not do anything. I didn't issue the apology that the student requested. I didn't even acknowledge that the student said anything. I don't know if that was the right or wrong thing to do, but that's what I did. Part of why this was my decision is because this was really when outrage culture was spinning up into sort of what we know it is today. This was like 5 years ago. A little more than that. This was happening at the time when we really started seeing public figures being called out for behavior and them issuing the sorry not sorry. This was around the same time that started happening. And so, one, I didn't want to give a sorry not sorry apology. That's not how I am. If I'm going to apologize for something, I'm going to mean it. Second, as far as I could remember and tell, and from the other students in the class, I don't think I mocked the seminary students or mocked Catholics or ridiculed them in any way other than to say they're human. And if that's offensive, then holy shit. I discussed an experiment that demonstrated that even people who should be on their best behavior sometimes are just people. And that's the experiment. And I don't know how to say it otherwise. It might have been, it absolutely would have been different if I'd actually heard from these students who were allegedly offended. If one of those students came to me like, hey, I'm Catholic, and that was actually pretty offensive what you said, that'd be a whole different matter. But it was these anonymous, possibly imaginary students that she was taking ownership of their offense of, and I don't know if they exist or not. So it's a weird thing. If some students had come to me and said I was offended, that would be a whole different matter, and I would have gladly had a discussion with them over what I said, what the problem was, all of this, but that didn't happen. If these students had existed, these Catholic students, or even Christian students had existed that took offense, I would have thought it would have shown up in the student evaluations at the end of the year. But there was one kind of negative evaluation in the feedback talking about how disappointed they were, and I was discriminatory and, basically echoing what was said in that email, and so I'm pretty sure that was her. But that was it, just her. No other student came forward in the evaluations, which are completely anonymous, about this incident. And overall, this incident with this student made me think of so many times where you see people getting upset on behalf of other people. And so it's usually straight, white, cisgendered people who are getting offended about the depiction of somebody or people wearing something or other things where, they're saying this is racist, this is offensive, this is whatever. And you actually talk to members of the affected minority group, and largely it seems like they're not bothered and it's a non-issue. And this really felt like that to me. That being said, I get that as a white, cisgendered person, allyship is huge for people who are in minority groups. It's huge. And I know it's important for people of the majority to speak up for people of the minority because, they might not be in the place to do so. They might be oppressed or unable to say something without repercussions or any number of things. And so it's helpful for the majority to push for their rights because, voting is a majority process, or call out bad behavior on corporations or all of these things. But it's important to know if it's an issue that the minority group is actually bothered by to begin with. I also know who this student was. It was a large class, but I had enough tests and had enough interactions with students that the ones who showed up regularly, I knew who they were. I went through all that detail at the beginning of this video discussing the layout of the classroom because she was in that group that sat in that upper back corner and talked the entire time. She was not one of the students who engaged in lecture and asked questions and was interested in the class. She was showing up for whatever reason that possesses people to show up to the class and then just goof off the entire time. She was one of those. That being said, I did not punish her for this in any way. I'm not that type of person, for one. And two, my class is set up with the grading being automated or not necessarily in my hands so that my personal feelings might not seep into how people are graded or treated. So the DMT guy, for example, and so many stories about him. He drove me crazy. A lot of students didn't like him, but I didn't let that impact his grade in my class. In my class, you did the reading, there were quizzes. The quizzes were online and automatically graded. I didn't have to touch them unless there was a problem, and there were hardly problems. Then the tests were multiple choice, which was done by Scantron, and all I had to do was basically import it into an Excel sheet, make sure nothing went funky, and add it into the total score. The written components of the tests were handled by my teaching assistants, and I did not tell them about this incident. I don't know if they would have done anything with it. I don't know if the student actually emailed them, but that grading was not done by me. The only time I had to touch students' grades directly, really, was at the end of the year, when basically you dump out all of their grades, shove it into the online grading system for the school, and make sure that things transferred correctly. Like, I had to click a box that everybody's grade was correct. That's the only time I really had my fingers on her grade. I curved as a class. She did not face repercussions for this. Thankfully, other than the one disappointed and somewhat disgruntled evaluation from that section, there weren't really any consequences. I don't know if anybody in my department knew about this, if she talked to anybody else. I never found out. I didn't lose my employment because of this. So, yeah, I don't know if it would have been different if she had taken me to task on like Twitter or on Facebook or anything, but she didn't. It was just sort of between the two of us. So, yeah. That is the time that Outrage Culture kind of came after me for something I said. And I don't think it was warranted, but I wasn't listening necessarily to what I was saying in the class, so there is my disclosure of bias. Take it for what it is, and yeah, that's my story. For more content, kind of like this, but not really, subscribe to the channel. If you like finding out when these videos happen, click ring the bell. If not, that's cool. If you enjoyed this, like it. If you've experienced something similar, or receiving end, giving end, love to have a discussion in the comments or on Twitter about it. And support me on Patreon, because this stuff ain't ever getting monetized. Alright, see you guys in the next video. Bye.